Hello everybody and welcome to this new video, and also welcome to my desk. I've only showed my table before from a top view, but now when the phone doesn't have any cables hanging out from it anymore, I'm gonna switch it to my desktop so I can write the code more comfortably and still use the dials and buttons and all that I need to make it work. I have my red phone here already, which is working. I'm gonna turn this off by dialing a 9 and replacing it with the other phone that you're more familiar with. I prefer to have this red one on the desk though, because it looks like you have the hotline to the president or something. And I have a better place for the KTAS phone. But for now I'm gonna swap them, just to make it comfortable. In this video I will make a proper Python function for the dial and the buttons. I'm going to create classes for them that will run in its own thread and just repeatedly listen to inputs without blocking anything else. And then when something is pushed or dialed, then it emits a signal that tells another part of the program that something happened. So let's start by going into the directory, Retrophone Python. And here I'm gonna create a new file called inputs. I'm adding the O flag because I also want to open up the dial test as a reference, because I'm going to reuse a lot of that code. So here we have the new file at the top and the old in the bottom. I'm going to use a class called process, and that is the class that's going to run in its own thread. I also need the GPIO and I need time. So I'm going to make a dial class that just listens for the dialing and emits a signal, and that's going to be inheriting the process class. And that means that it has everything that the process class has, and then I just add more stuff on top of it. So first let's make an init function. That is the initializer, the things that happens when you create the instance of the class. A function that is in a class is called a method, and all methods refer to self, and self is the class instance itself, which can be a bit confusing. Another thing that can be a bit confusing is that now I have made a new init method in the dial class, and that's gonna override the init method in the process class. But I still need that because that has a lot of things in it for the process to work. So I can access that by calling super. And what I do now is I call the process init method from the dial init method. So it will run through all that first, and then it's gonna add my extra updates to this. And what I want to do in init class is set up the GPIO pins. And to find those pin numbers that the dial needs, I of course have my nice constants file. So I'm going to import pin for the pin numbers, and I also need dial first index. To know which number I actually dialed depending on what phone I'm using. The GPIO mode and all that will be handled by the main class that I'm gonna write later. So I'm gonna add that to a test function today just to make it work, but I'm not gonna let that be handled by this class. That's because it's gonna be a lot of things using the GPIOs, and I want it all to be handled by one central place instead of here. And how the process class works is that it has a run function that is executed when you start it. So that's where I'll put the code that should start this redial process. So if I switch back to my other document, so it's basically this part that should be in the run function. So when it's running, it's gonna while through sleep for 0.1 seconds, then loop through. Of course, not the yellow, but the dial active. Then of course, you also need the read dial function. And that's of course going to be a part of the class. So I need to type self.before because it's a part of the class itself, if that makes sense. And I also need to copy that over. So when the dial starts, then the run function is gonna loop through, and if it finds the dial to be active, then it's gonna go to the read dial function. Count is 0, pulse state 0. And then while GPIO, it should not be equal to yellow, it should be equal to dial active. And pulse state should of course not be green, it should be dial pulse. If not pulse state and all pulse state count plus equals 1, all pulse state equals pulse state. Yes. That looks about right. If not count, return none. It should never be possible to not have a count, since it's always counting at least once. But just because if there's a glitch, then I don't want it to register 0. So I'm gonna leave it there just for a safety precaution. If count equals 10, then count equals 0. Yeah, that works. But now I also want to compensate for which number it starts on. So let's make a new value called number instead. And number is equal to count minus 1 plus dial and the logic behind this is that if I dialed a 1, for example, in this KTAS phone, then that's gonna represent the number 1, and the dial first index starts with 1. So if you take the count of 1 minus 1 plus 1, then it's going to be equal to 1. But if I do this on a red phone, that starts on 0, so dial first index is a 0, then the number is gonna, the count is gonna be 1 when I dial the 0, I take it -1 to get to 0, plus 0, which is in that case the dial first index. So in that case it makes sense as well. I basically want the count to start at 0 and then I want to add the index. Actually, so if number equals 10, the number will equal 0. And that works, but another way I could do this that actually looks a little bit nicer, I would say, is to take the result of this number and %10. And what that does in coding is that it's dividing this number by 10 as many times as it can, and then it returns the end value. So it basically just keeps the 1th position. If I in theory would have 12 dials and I would get the number 12, then it would return the 2 and so on. So I'm going to do it like that because I think it looks nicer. And then I return the number. So that should work. Let's make a test function for this. And as I said before, I'm adding the set mode to the test function, because I'm going to assume later that that has already been done when this function gets called in the main scope. So I'm creating an instance of the dial class, and then I'm going to start it. And that's going to execute the run function. And in the keyboard interrupt, I'm going to add a termination for the dial and the GPIO cleanup. Alright, let's test if this works. When I try to dial something, that works perfectly fine. Right now it's not much of a difference from the test dial, but the next step is to add another class for the buttons. And then it's going to make a difference, because then I can both read the dial and the buttons at the same time. So let's do the same with the buttons. I'm going to make a new class called buttons that inherits from process. And now in the run function, I don't want it to print or emit every time it loops, because that's going to be spamming just like the test function before. So I just want to see when there's a change in the signal, when it's not the same as it was in the last loop. So because of that, I need to first create some old state that's gonna contain the value it had in the last run, and I set it to 0 as default in the first run. I'm going to do the tilt a little bit different from the rest, but I'll come to that later. Let's do the while loop. That's going to repeat itself forever, but even while loops need some sleep sometimes. So let's start with the handset. So first I need to find the new state of it, and that's of course from the GPIO input. If handset new state is not equal to handset old state, then there's been a change. And what is the change then? If the new state is true, that means the button has been pushed. But if not, it means the button has been released. And the last thing I want to do is to set the new state as the old state, because that should of course be updated for the next round. I only need to do that if the state has been different, otherwise it's going to be the same anyways. So let's do the same with the hook. And if the hook state has changed and it's now true, that means that somebody picked up the phone. And if it's changed to false, then somebody hang up the phone. And then it's the tilt left, and that I'm gonna do a little bit differently. Because if the old tilt state is up, then it's gonna listen to the down input, and if that activates, then it's gonna change to down. If it's down, it listens to the up output, and if that's activating, then it changes to up. So if it's not up, then it's down, and then it's checking the tilt up. But instead of writing else if, I can just combine it like that. It means the same thing. And then I can move all this like that. So now I can print out the button states too. Let's add this to the test function. Let's check if it works. If I lift this up, if I press the button, and if I tilt it. And the good thing here is that I can at the same time dial a number and nothing affect each other. Because they're running on different threads. And that's the beauty of multithreading. Another thing I want to do is to make the dial class return a multi-digit number, so I can dial code that activates something, or a phone number, for example, and the dial class should return that entire number as a string. So to do that, I need to declare a variable that's going to be the number, defaults to empty string when nothing has been dialed. And I also want to check if I haven't dialed any digits for, say, 2 seconds, then it's going to return the full number. But if I continue dialing within 2 seconds, then it's going to just add that number on top of the other ones. So I'm going to make an instance variable called last dial, and that will contain the timestamp from when I dialed the number the last time. So if last dial, then I want to compare that to the current time. So if self last dial is a lower number than time, which is right now, -2, which is 2 seconds ago from right now. So if last dials is less than 2 seconds ago from right now, then I'm gonna print the number. And then I'm gonna reset it. So I can dial another number. And that should be it, I think. If I dial a long number. One, two, three, four, 5. And it shows 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah, that all seemed to work pretty nicely. So the buttons are working fine. The dial is returning proper numbers, but it's not gonna be very helpful to just print everything out. It needs to emit a proper signal that can be used in other functions. I want these classes to call other classes. I'm gonna make a signal for the dial called number, and it of course has the instance variable number. That's gonna be the number string. I also need a number slot, and that will contain all the functions that needs to know when the number has been dialed. And this won't be defined in this class, it will be defined in the main class that will set those slots. In the end of this class, I'm gonna make 2 new functions. So first the connect number method, and the main class will call this method and add the functions that this should call, if that makes sense. It probably will later otherwise. So it takes a function as an argument, and it's add that function to the number slot. And then I need a emit method. And the emit method loops through the slot number list and calls those functions. And it adds the number as the argument to those functions. So it goes through the slot number list and takes out its function, call it func, and then it calls func with self.number as an argument. And then up here, instead of printing number, I'll run the emit method. So when the number has been dialed and is done dialing, I'm gonna turn this into a function as well. And when the dial is done, then it's gonna emit the number, which means it's gonna call all the functions that the main function has given it to call. And then it's going to reset the number string, reset the last dial, and then it's ready to dial again. So let's go to the bottom here, to the test, and create a function, call number, why not? And it takes a number as argument, and I'm just gonna print out calling number. And then here in the test function, I'm going to connect the number signal to call number. And I'm not adding the end brackets to the call number because I don't want to call the function now. I just want to reference it. So when the number has been dialed, then the call number function will be in the list of functions to call. So let's try this out. So I'm gonna dial 1, 2, 3, and then it's calling the function that prints out calling 1, 2, 3. 6, 8, 4, calling 684. So now by using this signal we can signal other functions to make use of the numbers and buttons. So now let's do the exact same thing for the button class as well. And here I want one slot for the tilt, and that should be returning up or down depending on how it tilts. But the other ones, I want one for button pressed and one for button released and one for the hook when it's hanging up or pick up. And they are not gonna emit any data, they're just gonna call the function without giving any value to it. The tilt is gonna emit both when it's turning up and down, so it's going to need an instance variable that knows which one is the current state, and I'm gonna replace the tilt old state with that one. Like that. So let's make a new function. I'm just going to call it button test. And since the different buttons have different arguments, I'm just gonna use this very general args, which I'm usually not a fan of, but in this case it works. Then you can just give it any number of arguments or none if you don't want that, and it's just gonna make a list of all of them. So let's test it out. So this one emits up and down. This one is only registering when I take off the hook for some reason. And you can't really see what's going on. And that's because it's only emitting. It doesn't register what is being emitted. So to fix that, I can use a lambda function. So instead of having this that is just printing out stuff, I can pass it a lambda. That takes arguments, and then it's printing out tilt. So let's test this again. Tilt, none. Tilt up, tilt down. Button pressed, button released. And now it's actually lambda functions that is printing this. And I can of course dial a number while I'm doing this. Because it's running on different threads, so nothing is interrupting anything else. And that's the beauty of multithreading and signals. The next step will be to create the main functions that control all this. And then I can start doing something useful with these buttons and dial. The last thing to do is to add this to Git. And that's it for this time. Next time I'll create a main class that is controlling the buttons and that will assign those to useful things, like controlling the lights or something else. Well, that's it for this time. Thank you for watching.